Welcome to BCDC Keep On Talking podcast. This time we are going to talk about the complexity of the electricity system. And I have two guests here, so guys, why don't you present yourselves?
Well, thank you, Rauli. My name is Pouttu. I'm a professor of dependable wireless systems. I come from a research unit called the Center for Wireless Communications, and one of the reasons why I am probably in this discussion is that my role is to look at ICT enablers to different verticals, from which, of course, energy is a very big vertical.
Yes, so I'm Florian, Kühnlenz, PhD student here at the University of Oulu. And I basically took a deep dive into how the electricity market works to find out where is actually the attacking point of the ICT. And I guess that's what we are going to discuss also today.
So as you mentioned, you come from the Center of Wireless Communications. And you do see a role for energy there, but electricity still needs cables. So how come wirelessness?
Yeah, cables are, of course, there. The wireless power transfer is not solved yet.
You're right.
But the future, especially electricity grid, requires electrons to flow two ways, but also information to flow two ways.
Right.
And in many cases, the wireless communications, either for the cost reasons or for mobility reasons, such as, for instance, the electric vehicles or some other reasons, the wireless component becomes essential. And for instance, in the smart grid, which we are talking about, it is more viable to have wireless components in the future because we are introducing a large number of microgeneration into the system, and retrofitting those with cables might not always be wise. It's easier to actually integrate wireless devices into these new components added into the grid. And these, of course, then have system level implications where we need to really fast control something. And the upcoming evolutions of wireless actually provide really fast communications, meaning low latency, which allows a magnitude of new services to be introduced into the grid.
And there's going to be a lot of new services and then also a lot of new traffic.
Exactly.
And that's why we need new solutions there also.
And of course, another angle on this is that you don't want to push everything through the same cable. So you actually might want to be able to still communicate with something even if the cables are broken. So which is especially one of the points for the smart grid, that you might be able to like fix the grid kind of on the fly if something breaks. So you might be able to like use some part of the grid that's still existing in kind of like an islanding mode. And then you want to still communicate with the parts there. And if you actually send all through the same wire, then you won't be able to do that.
Like a quality assurance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
CVC was just chosen as the other one of the two flagships that the Finnish Academy chose a few weeks ago. 6 Genesis. So what is 6G? And is there a role for energy also there?
Yeah. Well, let me give you a few words about the 6 Genesis itself. As you mentioned, it's the one of the two large Academy of Finland flagship programs.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Very good choice.
And our topic is to, in this flagship program, is to look at 6G enablers. We all know that currently 5G is the hot potato. So choosing to go for 6G, it's a fine line between genius and crazy, right?
But you believe in the first one.
We believe in the genius, and luckily Academy of Finland also believes in the genius. And what we are actually looking in the 6G, of course, is to come up with the latest results so that the 5G undelivered parts will be researched. But then really go for the 6G enablers. And the 6G basically is all about data. So everything will be optimized in the network and in the verticals related to the data.
And energy is one of the important verticals.
Yeah, we have selected. Yeah, we have selected 4 verticals, which are automotive, industry 4.0, so factories, health, and energy. And these 4 are the key driving verticals for 6G research, since European Union sees these as the verticals requiring the 6G in the future.
So our collaboration will go on.
Will go on
also in the flagship.
Exactly. And
all right, fine. But let's then move to the topic of today, the complexity of the electricity system. Florian, you have been thinking about this complexity problem for some time. So how would you describe complexity in sort of general words?
So I think the first difficulty is that we often use complexity in everyday language almost the same as complicated. So these 2 words, they are like, when we just like talk in everyday language, they are almost used equally. But of course, in like scientific language, they mean something very different. So like to make an example, if you look at the engine of a car, this is something. This is actually, it's complicated. Like nobody will like open up the hood of the car, look at the engine, and say like this. I totally understand how this works. But
at least I don't.
yeah. And but I think like even mechanical engineers, it's a difficult thing. Like many moving parts, but they are all like basically moving in the same direction. Like they are all coupled together. Everything, like if you actually start the engine, everything in there moves, and everything in there moves with the same rate, because it's all like on one string. But and this is why we say it's complicated, but in a scientific sense you wouldn't say this is complex, because all the parts are moving together, like they are all coupled all the time. In a complex system, you have many parts that can do things individually. And so, for example, you have these in like many social systems. You can also have it in technical systems. So, for example, in the electricity grid, you have usually many generators that are actually like producing the power. And they are, in a sense, like acting individually, because there's nothing directly connecting those generators. So they are very far away. Like you might have like one in Oulu, one in Helsinki, and in Tampere, and so on. And they are like powering all of Finland. And but now you all somehow have to coordinate them. And this then like
then it becomes a complex task to do the coordination.
It's a complex task. It might also be complicated. So it can also be that you have like something that is actually complex, but it's not especially like complicated to understand or to control. So these 2 terms then like really need to be separated apart. So to be a bit more specific, when we talk about complexity, there are like no really good definitions of what it actually is, but there are a few things that we also have on the slide here that we usually consider like kind of like necessary to be there. So one is the spontaneous order. That is, there is no order in the system that we actually like force on it, but if you just kind of like let it happen, let it play out, it will find some way of order, of stability that occurs. This is pretty much what is in economics, for example, often called emergent behavior. So this like typical example of from Adam Smith with the invisible hand would be an example of spontaneous order.
Leading to an optimal solution. Even though everyone is behaving on their own preferences.
Everybody acts on self-interest, but yet we actually end up in an order of the system where we actually find an optimum.
Which doesn't always happen, even in markets.
No, of course not. But this is the idea.
This is the idea.
And so this also like very much leads to the second point. There is a certain robustness to this order then, and there's also no central control. In a sense, again, like in the economy, for example, there is no central control of the economy. So there is no, like, at least in the way we do it nowadays. And once this order, once the system is in this like ordered state, it's usually hard to kind of get it out from there. Like there can be some outside influences, but usually kind of bounces back.
But shocks happen, and of course shocks then bring randomness in the table. And is randomness one specific part of complex systems as well? Is it not necessary to be there?
Yeah, I think like there's almost always some element of randomness there.
Yeah, okay.
But it's not.
But it's not a necessary condition.
No, like at least the literature commonly doesn't describe it as a condition.
Yeah.
So then, very typically, you need some kind of feedback loops. So somehow the elements of the system, they need to influence each other. Otherwise, I mean, it's kind of simple, because otherwise nothing happens. If nobody talks to each other, then nothing gets done.
It's not a system.
Yeah, exactly. And the last thing is numerosity, which basically means you need to have many elements for something to actually happen. It's also like some of these are kind of obvious, but it's still good to actually like remind about them.
Okay. But then also a nice example here.
Yes. So we have an example video here of what is a very everyday known phenomena of complex systems, which is the traffic jam that forms out of nothing. So we see here cars driving in a circle, and the task of the drivers is actually just to drive with a safe distance to the car in front of them.
They have been asked to drive with a certain speed.
Exactly. They should be driving with a certain speed, and of course try to keep safe distance.
Yeah, sure.
And now we see in the beginning that everything is fine. The circle moves, every car with roughly the same speed, and then all of a sudden we see a traffic jam basically appearing. Yeah. And nobody wants this, so this is...
But they don't have automatic speed control or any other artificial intelligence there.
Exactly.
But this is something that happens in real life. Real life, everyone who has been marching in a long queue, even for some time, knows this effect. In the beginning, everything goes very nicely, but after a while, the tail of the queue, the guys there, they run and stop and run and stop, and that's exactly the same. It happens in real life. Of course.
So and I think like everybody knows the situation. You are like driving along a street, and all of a sudden you're in a traffic jam, and you're expecting some kind of accident, but then the traffic jam clears and you see nothing, and you're wondering like, why is this actually happening?
Yeah.
And then this is an example of emergent behavior. It's also a case of spontaneous order. Also, we wouldn't actually like this kind of ordering that is happening there. Yeah, we don't like this like order in form of the traffic jam, but it's still a state of order.
Right. Okay, then let's move to electricity market. How do these phenomena then show up in the electricity market?
Yes. So of course the electricity market is generally both. So it is complicated because it's just not an easy technical problem. And it's also complex because we have many players interacting in various ways with each other. And as in most markets, for example, the price formation is something that is definitely a complex process.
Right.
That is happening there. And
we have also different time spans. We have the day-ahead market where the prices are for the spot prices.
Yes.
And then we have the intraday markets, and we have the balancing market. So we have 3 types of markets there. So also those make it a very complex system. Yes,
and I think these are more on the side of complicated to begin with. Maybe we should like start a little bit more with the concept. So usually you have like a very long-term market where you deal like with like time spans from up to several years, where electricity gets traded. Usually it's over-the-counter trading, so it's usually not at a centralized marketplace. Then in most of the cases you have some kind of day-ahead spot market where electricity gets traded for the next 24 hours. Then you usually have a state below that, which is the intraday market, where electricity gets traded like for an hour, 15-minute periods. And then afterwards you have a balancing market where electricity doesn't really get traded, but you make an offer that you are able to like produce or consume in a very short term.
Because the market needs to be in equilibrium every second.
Yes. And this is again another element of like where it's complicated. Like technically you need to balance out production and consumption all of the time.
Right. But then this also creates uncertainties to the market, because players have to make forecasts what will happen tomorrow, and then it's possible that these forecasts never realize then in the real time, and this probably brings costs to the system.
So here I think we should talk a little bit more about how this Dayahead market actually works. I think this is kind of the most important and somewhat misunderstood part in public discussion at the moment. So the way these Dayaheads market works is, and it works like this for very good reasons, is that the producers, they offer into the Dayahead market how much electricity they are able to produce at what time for what price. So these are the three things.
Based on their forecasts, what will happen next day?
Yeah, based on their forecast. For example, if it's a renewable producer, then they have some forecast about how it might look like. And if it's a traditional power plant, of course they also have like some idea about the technical specifications. There can also be failures, but let's leave those out for the moment. And then you also have to make a forecast for what is the consumption, because the consumption is way less predictable because it depends on many factors. Depends on the weather, depends on like when people actually turn on their water cooker or their sauna in the evening, and all these kinds of things. But of course we can make a prediction about how much electricity we will probably need for the next day, at which hour, and also what we might be willing to pay for that. And so this is the other side of the market, which also gets offered into the market. Then the market operator actually matches these bids and offers, and what we get out.
Solves the price.
Yes, what we get out is, for one thing, the price, but this is actually not the important part of the whole equation. The important part that we get out is actually the schedules for how the power plants should run, and therefore also like solving this coordination problem of like which power plant should run at which time.
Right.
So, of course,
the merit order.
Yes. So the merit order, and like really like what you get out is for every power plant you get to know like how much megawatts should they produce during what hour. And so at this stage they are actually bound to this plan. So they are not bound to say, okay, the price is high enough, so now we produce something or we don't. But this is often the public perception of how this market works. We very often like you hear, oh, the electricity at the market is cheap, so there should be more people can buy it and so on. But this is not how this market is set up. It's set up very different in that you actually make the prediction of how much you would like to have at a certain hour for which price, and then you get told, okay, you can have so much for this price. And then you take it. And now we come to this problem of why these forecasts and so on are so important.
Okay, but before we go there, you have been modeling now this complex system using agent-based models.
Yes.
Why did you choose agent-based approach to this type of system to use as the model?
So agent-based modeling is a somewhat new concept, because it very much relies on you having a computer to actually simulate the system. So you don't just have an equation system that you might be even able to solve by hand, but it very much relies on that you actually do like computer simulations. And of course there are like many reasons why you might want to choose agent-based simulations. For me, one of the main reasons is that it is like the prime way to simulate a complex system. And the other reason is that it's like, I think it matches just the general way in there, matches really close with how electricity markets work. That you have these like players in forms of producers and consumers that are like acting in this marketplace, and this whole structure for me kind of screams agent-based modeling.
Okay, right. But an economist asks, looking at the agent-based models, where are the behavioral equations and behavioral assumptions? Almost everything is based on some kind of distribution logic and randomness based on those. So how do you see that?
I think the big advantage there for the agent-based modeling is that you can like make really wild assumptions if you want about the behavior. Right. So you're not strictly confined to what you can easily express in an equation. You can actually like take some form of algorithmic, like just a description of the behavior, and which can be like arbitrarily complicated. If you want, it can also be very simple. And so this really goes actually into direction of what is behavioral economics these days, where they also very often actually like work more with a description of the behavior than in kind of equation to model it. Yeah.
Exactly, not deterministic equations. Okay, so what did the model show up then?
Yes, so going back to the research, what we did is that we set up, as previously described, this spot market, Dayahead market, and then we also have a second stage, which is the balancing market. And the balancing market is basically to account for all the things that are not correctly forecasted in the spot market. So if anything like doesn't quite match in these like hourly schedules, then it needs to be corrected in at least 15-minute steps in the balancing market. And now what we did then is we took this like very common idea at the moment of saying, okay, now we have this like price that the market spits out, and now we use this price to kind of optimize the behavior of the consumers in the market. Exactly doing like buying electricity when it is cheaper and using a little bit less when it is more expensive.
Assuming that they have real-time price contracts.
Exactly. Yeah. And
this is the Nordic Nord Pool context that we are.
Yes, the whole system is as closely as we could like modeled to the Nord Pool area.
Okay. And so does the model show then that these forecast errors, they do bring costs to the system?
Yes, exactly. So the problem that appears is it is in some ways not so surprising. On the other hand, it is also somehow an emergent phenomena. So what happens is you see, as the consumer, you see that there is a low price part of the day, and so you will shift your electricity consumption there.
Right.
And which is like seems like very logical and a sane thing to do. But of course, this means that during these hours, there is actually more consumption than was originally forecasted. So now this extra consumption needs to come from somewhere. Like somebody needs to produce it, because as we discussed, like there is no power plant that has the schedule to produce more. The schedules were already set. That's why the price is low. And so now this actually comes from the balancing market. And this will mean that there is basically a little bit rising costs.
The price is higher there.
But of course, these balancing costs, at least how everything is at the moment, they are not attributed to anyone in specific. So they are usually like spread over all the users.
Okay. Yeah. But then we also found out, or there is a solution to this problem. How did we solve that in the model?
Yeah. So the problem that of course is that in these like low price zones, you switch there, then there would be a correction basically happening on the next day, because that's the next time when the spot market can react again. So on the next day, on this hour, the price might be a little bit higher because last time. So, and this most likely means that this hour is not the cheapest one anymore. So if I am flexible with my consumption, I will actually go to another hour that might be cheaper. But then again, the prediction doesn't work out anymore. So that's this like circle that develops. You always jump away from the hour that is a little bit more expensive.
Right.
If that's possible. And that's kind of the assumption that we put in there, that this kind of flexibility is actually there.
Right.
And the way to solve this is actually to include this flexibility into the marketplace.
Right, endogenize it.
Yes. So in a sense, the flexible consumption would be treated very similar to the producers of power, in that it would actually get a schedule of when it should consume. Yeah. So the utility would actually know and coordinate how much flexibility the users have inside of the utility, then bid this into the market. The market could actually optimize for the whole system and say, okay, it would be best if, say, half of your users go on this hour and half go on the other hour, and then we have 2 hours where we have like pretty low price.
So the utilities would be bidding several profiles.
Yes, the utility would basically make different profiles. Say, what I can offer you as a utility is like, I have some kind of base profile, and then we have like several options that we can take, and the market basically then can figure out this would be the optimal option to go.
Okay, right. And then the model shows the green lies here so that the costs don't rise as much as when there is only the RTP based behavior of the consumers.
In the model, what we see here is that in the orange curves, especially in the first plot here, is for the whole system under this real-time pricing regime. And we see at first, if we only have a little bit of flexibility on the x-axis is the flexibility, we actually see a drop in price. So it actually gets better. But and this is where the emergent behavior actually comes in. At some point, the flexibility is big enough so that it actually kind of reflects itself back in the system. So flexibility is big enough to create its own price peak.
Right.
And this is when it like
there's the feedback loop.
Exactly. This is this feedback loop developing. So when this feedback loop like starts to happen, the flexible users start to avoid the price peak that they just created. And this is then what really drives up the balancing costs, what we called here system costs in the last plot. And this was what makes the costs here go through the roof. And compared especially to the integrated regime, where we actually treat the flexibility as something that can be bid into the market with these like profile blocks, and then costs actually stay low beyond this point.
Right. Very interesting. So flexibility is needed. Consumer-based real-time price flexibility is good to some point, but then the system-wide flexibility needs to be endogenized into the system, and that's where the complexity issue is at the table. How to solve that?
Yeah,
and we are in the beginning, but what are the next steps? How do you see how to proceed from here?
Yeah, I think it might be good exercise, and then because then we also really get into where to proceed is if we take this back to the reality. Like now we have been talking like very abstract. So how would this look like? What is actually like a flexible user? Or what is like the flexibility in the system? And it can be something simple as for like a dishwasher. Yeah. So a dishwasher, you like fill it up in the morning, and then you say like when I'm back home at like 6 in the evening, be ready. Otherwise, I don't care. You can go on whenever you want. And now, what we would really like to have in the like future is that this dishwasher is actually running in the cheap hours of the day, where, for example, we have like lots of solar power happening in the system.
Exactly,
so we would like to like take these dishwashers and let them run during the sunny hours of the day.
That's a very, very good example. Shows how the demand response needs also to be interpreted in a more broad view than just all the peak price reactions.
Exactly.
We have also been talking a lot about the virtual utilities and aggregators and microgrids. Ari, how do you see those in this context? Do they have a role also here?
Of course, and as one of the future actions, we wish to build some kind of a real model of virtual power plant, which is basically a example of this, how we deal with the flexibility in the system and how we build smart grid in local level, so these what we call microgrids.
Right.
So these can take into account then the local generation, may it be wind or solar. It can take into account this demand response, this dishwasher example.
Right.
It can integrate electric vehicles into the system, and it can
very important.
And of course, because of this storage problem with electricity, it can incorporate these storage systems into the system. So, so all of these add to the complexity, but at the same time provide the flexibility.
Exactly, and can be a solution.
Exactly.
To the problem.
Yes.
Florian, you are going to visit this German company, Electricity to the Market.
Yes.
Next autumn. Can you say something about that? Because those guys are doing exactly these things already at the moment.
Yes, so I will be visiting Energia to Market, which is a company mainly operating in Germany at the moment, but currently also expanding into the Finnish market with basically a virtual power plant solution. So they are grouping together many I think it's at the moment mostly flexible producers.
Right.
So which would be like very small production units that you actually like group together and then bid into the market, basically to avoid like similar issues as we've just discussed.
Yeah, exactly.
And but of course they will also be looking into how to deal with the flexibility on the consumer side. So how would you group together all these dishwashers?
We might have something to offer there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so very interesting questions in our table in the future.
Yeah, indeed.
Thank you guys. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you very much.
Nice to talking to you.
Yes, nice talking to you.
Yeah.